I started thinking about what kinds of things I would want to cover if I were to talk about native plants. And you know, the big question is always why? You know, why should I choose native plants? But then, of course, after that is, if I go that route, if I choose native plants, then what am I supposed to do? How do I, you know, where do I go from there? So that's kind of what I built my presentation around tonight, was that basic idea. Whoops. All right, we'll do it that way. Okay, so I thought I'd start off with your basic terminology. I have a tendency to do that when I teach, so I always start with terms. What do we mean by native plant? Because there's a lot of confusion over this whole idea of native plants. And ultimately, if we're calling something a native plant, then we're saying that this plant evolved in this region. If it's non-endemic or non-native, then it didn't occur here before somebody introduced it here. It did not actually evolve here. Now, more recently, we've kind of expanded this idea of non-native to include two other terms. So a plant that is invasive, is not native, and also is going to cause harm to the ecosystem. So those are ones that we would especially want to avoid. Now, we also have plants out there that we call adaptive or adapted, and they're not native, but they're also not invasive, which means they don't tend to escape, they don't tend to take over an area, and they will thrive here. So they're also you know, something that's, you know, that's usually recommended as another choice. So I thought, all right, what are some of the examples of not native and also potentially invasive plants that I can think of that are kind of common? People see them, people buy them. One of them that popped into my head was Japanese honeysuckle. Now, Japanese honeysuckle, as the name might imply, is not from here, right? The name says it. And it does tend to be invasive. So it can escape, it can get out of control. It isn't from here. So one of the things that we like to encourage people to do is instead think about using a native alternative. And we have a beautiful one. It's called coral honeysuckle. If you notice, and I'll come back to these ideas later, but notice it has these nice tubular flowers, which means that the hummingbirds love it. It tends to start flowering pretty early, about the same time that the hummingbirds arrive. And also butterflies will enjoy it. So it's a wonderful choice, and it evolved here. And I'll come back to why that's such an important thought in a few minutes. Then we have this guy, and you know you've seen it in a lot of the landscaping for HOAs. Some people call it Nandina, they call it sacred bamboo. And here's the thing about it. Not only is it, well, it doesn't tend to escape a lot, but it can escape. What really bothers me about Nandina is that the fruit is extremely toxic. Birds that eat this fruit will die a horrible death. And that's something that we should try to avoid. We have native alternatives to this idea. So these are a couple that have been recommended before. They have a nice shrubby appearance for you. They're native. Germander bush is a nice white flowering alternative. Texas sage or cenizo, another great alternative. And they evolved here. What about ground cover? A lot of people like to put in some ground cover in places rather than grass, especially in shady spots, and I don't blame you. But again, look at the name, Asiatic jasmine. So clearly it is not native, not from here. Now I wouldn't call it so much invasive. I don't think it really escapes much, but it is not a native plant. Here are some thoughts to consider, some alternatives. This is a lovely little one. Some people call it straggler daisy, some people call it horse herb. And you know what I love about this little plant? You can actually use it as a lawn. It is so hardy. You can walk on it, you can mow it. It's extremely hardy. If you're looking for ground cover, think about something like frog fruit. This is a lovely little plant. Mine, I have little patches that have come up in my backyard this year. Looks, you know, creates a cover that looks a lot like this. And the butterflies adore it. And now it can't really be mowed. I wouldn't use it as a lawn, but it does make a wonderful ground cover. Now, having said all that, I don't have a problem myself with using some adapted plants now and again, especially if I'm looking for a little drama or I just want something in quickly and I found some nice big possibilities. So I did this with my a front flower bed. I have Jerusalem sage here. Now I keep that trimmed back. It does tend to get really big and almost out of control. I've got shrimp plant, and by the way, the butterflies and the hummingbirds seem to like it. The bees were all over this Jerusalem sage. And then this one's Thryallis. It's not blooming yet. And I'll come back to this idea too later, some alternatives to controlling some of your pests. So the point I'm making here is that, you know, there's nothing wrong with choosing some adapted plants as well. Sometimes they're easier to find and they will do well here. You don't have to water them a lot. So back to the native plant idea. Why are your native plants so important? Why do we, you know, why do we focus on them and try to encourage people to grow them? Well, for obvious reasons, they're well suited to this location, right? They evolved here, they're adapted to here, they are adapted to whatever soil or lack of soil you have on your property. You don't have to add topsoil, you don't have to add amendments necessarily, you don't have to fertilize your native plants. They don't even really appreciate being fertilized. And one of the things I'd like to ask you to consider is the fact that when fertilizer runs off of your property, off of your landscaping, it's going straight into waterways oftentimes. And if it goes into lakes, streams, creeks, it can cause algae blooms, which can deplete that whole water system of oxygen. We have a lovely aquifer, our primary one being the Edwards Aquifer, and it has some upsides and downsides. Upside is it recharges quickly. The downside is it recharges quickly, okay? So you have to remember that what you're putting on your lawn could be going straight down into our aquifer. Of course, your native plants have evolved here, which means they're accustomed to drought. They're fine with that. They're going to be okay when it doesn't rain for a couple of weeks. We tend to go into watering restrictions once it comes summertime, and your plants are going to be okay. They're going to get through that with minimal watering. So I always like to do this. We do this in our in a native landscaping class as well, and look at, this is a picture I pulled off the web. It's beautiful, right? This is a beautiful landscape. You could even make the claim that There's numerous different types of plants here. It looks wonderful. Isn't this what I should have? But from an ecological point of view, this is actually a desert. This monoculture lawn that's in the front is harboring no insects, no life whatsoever, because it's typically been covered with fertilizer plus pesticides, herbicides, and it's not supporting any local insects or pollinators. And unless these are natives, they're really not doing much of that either. So think about, so what we have to kind of do is rethink what we envision as a wonderful landscape. And I'd like to give you some other landscapes to look at and consider. I think these are quite beautiful. And oops, sorry. There we go. So I picked this picture because I've heard people say this before. They hear the word Xeriscape, and what happens in their head is that it sounds like Zero-scape. And that's not what that is. Yes, you can have a rock garden, right, and not have to worry too much about plants or watering or the like. But this is quite beautiful, I think. It requires very little water, and they're using native plants. This one as well. This is a little bit more traditional, so you can still have your somewhat traditional look. It's a little bit different, but this landscaping is full of native plants, and you could actually consider either one of these more of an ecosystem than just a landscape. So one of the things that really got me, kind of solidified the idea of native plants to me, because my husband was Air Force. We moved all around the world. So I never paid a lot of attention to landscaping for the location too much until I really settled here. But this book really hit home for me. It's not necessarily about Texas. It's about a lot of other places, but the message is very clear that your native plants are the foundation of biodiversity around here. Everything relies on everything else, right? It's a relationship. That's the way ecosystems are. They're relationships. All the pollinators around here truly rely on your native plants. And here's a couple of the points from that book that just really struck me. That if you take all of the animal species on this planet, over a third of them are actually herbivorous insects. And I guess you wouldn't say all, but nearly every bird out there relies on insects to feed their young. So it's nice to have bird feeders out, and seeds and things like that. And yes, they're going to rely on that somewhat. But when it's time to raise their young, they need to have those insects. So if you have non-native plants in your landscaping, yeah, they might be providing some food in terms of nectar. You'll find butterflies on your zinnias, right? Absolutely. But those non-native plants are not a place for those insects to lay their eggs. They're extremely specific to what type of plant they're going to lay their eggs on and raise their own young. And so the insects are kind of the bottom level of this ecosystem around here, and they feed a lot of other organisms. They feed the birds, they feed a lot of other insects, they feed your snakes, they feed your lizards. So they really are the basis of this food chain. Even more distressing, I've been hearing some figures lately, and I did a little digging before tonight, that According to what we're reading, for about the last decade, about 40 or a little over 40% of all insect species in the US are experiencing decline. And in some places in the world, it's actually higher. So I'm kind of asking you to get on board with the whole idea, right? To add native plants into your landscape for a lot of different reasons. And one of them is actually insects. Another nice point that's been made before is that using native plants kind of creates a sense of place for you. You look at this landscape right here, I'm pretty sure it was from Austin. You wouldn't have any doubt that this landscape came from this part of the world, right? Or this part of the country. So it's very distinctive, and you can take pride in that lovely distinction. So what do you do now? How do you go about choosing your best plants? So we could spend an entire hour, obviously, on landscaping, and I am not a landscaping expert, so that is the last thing I'm going to attempt to do. But I pulled this picture off of the internet just to kind of give you an idea of how you might assess what you're trying to do. How much soil do you actually have to work with? Are you going to be able to plant a lot or a little? How much sunshine do you experience on your yard? And is it mostly morning? Is it mostly afternoon? Is it all through the day? Make some assessments of what you've got going on. How much space do you have to allocate? And especially if you're thinking about putting in trees, never forget, oh goodness, sorry, trips very easily. Never forget that you have to account for how big that tree is going to be when it's mature. So you have to make sure you're placing big items like trees appropriately so that you'll have adequate space once they become mature. And then you can kind of go from there. You know, what shrubs might I have space for and where would be a good place? What other smaller bedding plants or other plants might I be able to place in there? What kind of drainage do you have? And do you have any spots in your yard where water pools when it rains? Because if you do, you might have to make some adjustments to what you want to choose, because a lot of our native plants would prefer not to have what we call wet feet, right? They don't like having really damp roots for any extended period of time. And then, of course, you know, just start thinking about what is your overall goal. And there's nothing wrong with starting small, thinking small, working the natives into your space a little bit at a time as well. So, you know, think about what you're interested in bringing to your yard. Do you like to watch birds? Well, if you do, then you might want to have nesting sites as well as food for your birds. If you truly like hummingbirds, then make sure you're choosing at least some flowers that are tube-shaped. If you like to watch butterflies, then make sure you have flowers that are going to provide nectar, but it'd also be nice if you chose some plants that are what we call host plants. That means that is the type of plant that that butterfly is going to lay its eggs on, and I will expand on that just a little bit more in a moment. One of the best things that you can do if you really, you know, if you've got the space and really get encouraged about getting started with this, if you want wildlife in your landscape, think about trying to bring in a variety of heights. It's very visually pleasing. Look at how lovely this looks, and this. Very visually pleasing. Plus, You're going to provide nesting sites for birds. You're going to provide places for other animals, small animals to hide and feed and all of that kind of stuff. You know, you could have it all. And then of course your perennial plants that are going to come back. I love those, right? It's always nice to have something that's going to come back next year. There are also lots of annuals that are natives, of course, bluebonnets. And one of the things you might want to consider if you're putting in those annual plants and your HOA isn't going to bug you about it if you have an HOA, let those plants go to seed. Because if you let them go all the way to seed, then you can cast those seeds where you want to see them next year as well. And then you're still not buying plants year after year. Okay, so I also wanted to mention a program that's part of the Native Plant Society. We call it the NICE program, and it is a great place for getting some help about choosing plants. Initially, NICE stood for natives instead of common exotics, which is a very nice phrase to live by. And by the way, there's our website for the Lindheimer chapter of the Native Plant Society of Texas, which is the one I belong to. A newer version of this, it's kind of been reimagined, is Natives Improve and Conserve Environments. Also a very nice phrase, good to live by. But I put both of these here because if you go to participating nurseries that we have a partnership with for this NICE program, you'll find native plants that have been marked as native plants as part of this NICE program. So a couple of the more local places you can shop are the Canyon Lake Ace Hardware and also South Texas Growers. Now I know this is not the best time of year to be thinking about planting. Thank you. Not the best time of year to be thinking about planting, but think ahead. Those are great places to go. And also, as part of the NICE program, there is a list of recommended plants each year for spring, summer, fall, and you can go to our website and find this list every year. And these are plants that are going to be a little bit easier to find at your nurseries that support the NICE program. Also, there are native plant sales that happen around the area every year. SAWS does one, so you can always go to their website if that's convenient for you. In the New Braunfels area, we typically have two possibilities, Earth Day and Folk Fest. Both have been tentatively rescheduled, so crossing fingers. Hopefully we will get to have those in the fall. So Earth Day is located at Headwaters at the Comel, and there's the address. And they're planning theirs for October 10th. And Folk Fest at the Museum of Texas Handmade Furniture, also in New Braunfels, scheduled for October 17. Actually, it's 17 and 18. I only put one date there. I apologize. It's actually a Saturday and a Sunday. So in the fall, that'll be a great time to put in some new plants. And I know that, so our Native Plant Society chapter will be selling plants at Folk Fest, and we're trying to make sure our focus is on plants that are appropriate for that time of year, since we've had to kind of make a little bit of an adjustment for this year. Some other resources. So I have some things that are favorites to me that I use whenever I'm trying to decide on plants. And one of my favorite things to do is watch butterflies. So you've probably seen these. You can get them at H-E-B. You can get them at a lot of different stores around here. They're getting pretty common. And to me, this is a great guide because not only does it acquaint you with a lot of the common butterflies that you might like to see, but also it shows it shows what the host plant is. It shows what the caterpillar looks like. So it's a quick and easy guide. You can see mine's getting rather tattered. It's in my back pocket a lot. So it's a favorite. Also, a couple other options. Again, SAWS has a lot of resources and materials. This is something I happened to get in the mail. It's actually a couple years old, several years old, 2017. But you can go to gardenstylesa.com and they have loads of information about choices that you can make for planting for different goals that you might have. This is a book that comes out of Austin, out of the Texas AgriLife Extension, that the Native Plant Society chapters do sell at events. And that is another one of my favorites. It was a starting point for a lot of what I did. So you can always pick one up at one of our events. They never cost more than $2 at any Native Plant Society event. I did go online and Google this, and I did find that there is an online version of it available as well. So it's got a lot of other, lot of nice information in it. Good places to start. Now, back to the insects. I know that kind of makes people a little wary. You know, why am I didn't plan on encouraging insects to live in my landscaping. But again, I'm encouraging you to consider it. Your plants will not be decimated. If you read the Bringing Nature Home book, he makes some really good points about, you know, that misinformation that's out there about, you know, if I don't use pesticides, then my plants are just going to be decimated, and I don't want that to happen. Well, and this comes up more than once. Plant more than one. There is safety in numbers, typically. So when you choose a plant, it's best not to pick one, right? To just bring home one, because it may get consumed. But if you have several, yes, the insects are going to nibble on it, okay? But they typically won't consume all of any one plant or all of your species that's out there. They'll nibble a little here and a little there, and it's not actually typically as bad as you think it might be. And I'd like you to think about alternatives to using pesticides. A pretty new initiative, something I've been seeing and reading about a little bit, and I did a little digging when I was putting together this presentation, is something called integrated pest management. So using a wide variety of options to control the pests and still have your lovely garden. This is where I found the information that I'm using. It's a very nice website. So before you start putting pesticides down, monitor your plants. Watch how they're doing. If they're doing all right, then do nothing. If they start to show evidence of damage and the damage is going beyond what you can accept, then of course there's various removal options. You can remove insects manually, especially if they're bigger caterpillars, you know, and you don't want so many of them there, you can start to remove some. Steam can be a very effective tool. Also washing, and there's various different solutions that you can go online and find that are environmentally friendly. Usually involves just some very mild detergent in a spray bottle. And you can remove some aphids that way and some other insects that way. If, however, you decide that you really need to use some pesticides, use it only when you need to. You know, don't go out there and use them just because you think there might be a problem in the future. And try to be really precise about how you're applying it. Look for options that are less toxic. Look for options that are specific to the pest that you're trying to remove. Remember that if it's broad spectrum, that means it's going to kill everything. Whether you would like to see it there or not see it there, it's going to kill everything. So you just have to kind of keep that in mind. Try to create your balance as best you can.
Debbie, there was a question about, did you say spray them or steam them without hurting the plant?
You can actually do some steaming.
Okay.
I have not tried that method, and it may also kill some of the plant a bit.
Okay.
I know there's some very nice simple sprays you can make with like a dish detergent as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. Typically, I just don't use anything, honestly. And then, of course, everybody always asks this question. So which plants are deer-proof? Well, I'm not even going to start with that. We're going to use the word resistant, okay? So here's the bottom line, and I know nobody really wants to hear this. Deer will eat nearly anything when they are hungry. I've had them eat plants that I put in, like lantana, that they should never want to eat. I've had them nearly destroy a young century plant, which that one really shocked me, that they were messing around with my century plant. So nothing is outside of the realm of what they will consider when they get really hungry. Now, there are some plants that they will avoid. The more aromatic, the better. So plants that like rosemary, any of your sage plants, they're all they're all mints. They're all very aromatic, and the deer don't typically like them. Lantana is not typically preferred because it's got a really rough kind of leaf, especially our native lantana. Prickly, spiny, thorny, that makes sense, right? They're not gonna prefer that so much. And if the leaves are really fuzzy, it may be somewhat protected. Here's some other things you can do to kind of deter the deer. You can fence your plants. I personally have lots of them, okay? And especially when you just put something in the ground, sometimes you only have to have that fence in place for 2 or 3 weeks. And once the deer have gotten over being curious about what you planted, they may leave it alone. You may be able to take that fence away. New trees can really get browsed. Remember our white-tailed deer are browsers. They eat leaves, they eat new tree shoots, things like that, okay? They don't really eat grass, so they're looking for all those lovely leaves to eat. And of course, in the fall, you have to protect against the deer antlers. So if you have a small tree, you probably are going to want to fence it for a couple of years if you have deer about, and most of us do. Apparently, they like the new plantings at least somewhat, because there's usually fertilizer in that soil that you get from a nursery, and they just seem to love the smell of that. And they're going to pop it out of the ground just because it smells interesting. Back to safety in numbers. Okay, if you plant one thing, then there's a lot more chance that that one poor plant is going to be devastated. But plant a few. Try to be smart about the way you group your plants in your landscape. Let the tougher, hardier plants protect the delicate plants so that they can't get to them as easily. Lots of different little things that you can do to help. So I thought I'd finish this up with why I love my native landscape. And I want to show you some of the things that I've done around my yard and why I did them, and what makes me very excited about my native landscape. It's so much more interesting than television. You can sit out there. I could sit out there for hours sometimes and just watch what's going on. I learn something new all the time. So this is some of my backyard. And I plant some things and I let some things just kind of come in. I kind of think of myself a little bit like like a sculptor that says, I know the art is in there. I just need to chip away a little bit to reveal it. So sometimes I chip away a few things. I remove a few things that I'd prefer not to have in certain areas. And the rest of it, I just kind of let do its own thing. So this is another bed that I have. And as a result of my variety of plants that I allow to grow up out there, I get to watch butterflies almost all the time. So this is a little juniper hair streak that was on, this is a Zyzotes milkweed that popped up in my yard. This is a beautiful red admiral we were seeing lots of. This is from this spring. So I had this little wild onion that came up in clumps. And one day I just sat there and took pictures of all these ladies that were on my wild onion. And then this is a lovely queen that was on some of my sages. And I have tried to make sure a little at a time. Now, I've been working on my yard going on 4 years, and it's just starting to evolve into something that I'm pretty proud of. I have a lot of, and I was very lucky about this. I have antelope horn milkweed just growing wild all over my yard. And so I've been, lucky enough to see some monarch caterpillars this year, and even monarchs. We got to watch one just as it had emerged from its chrysalis. That was pretty fantastic. I also have had this bracted passion flower growing on one of my oak trees for now a couple years, and this year it really got kind of robust and it's flowered quite a lot. But the Gulf fritillary butterflies have found it, and I noticed they've started laying eggs on my passion flower because that is their host plant. They love it. And so now I get to see Gulf fritillaries in my yard all the time, or often. Lots of other species that we've been documenting. So both my husband and I have been documenting species on our property. We decided to get kind of involved in iNaturalist, which that's a whole nother presentation, but it's a very nice free app that you can put on your phone and document what you're seeing. And that information is used by scientists and biologists all over, especially in the state. But and I think this was several days ago, we're past 136 species at this point. but we've seen, oh, so many walking sticks this year. I love looking inside the cactus flowers. They usually are full of different insects. Wolf spiders, these phoebes. So this kind of brings me back around to the beginning of my presentation. There was a nest right outside my front door up high, and a mama raised a nice little brood of phoebes this year, and they just kept coming back around to my front little fence. I guess this is where they felt comfortable. This is where they were raised. But again, she would not have been able to raise them here if there weren't enough insects for her to feed them. Yeah, you can find lots of good iNaturalist trainings if you get interested in it. I will warn you, it's very addictive. We have our phones with us almost all the time, and we are documenting about all, quite often. I'm just looking at a couple questions here. I don't know anything about the buck moth caterpillars. I wish I could say I did. And bat boxes are awesome if you have the space for it, but you have to read up on them. They need a particular type of space, and it could be 5 years before you actually see bats in it. So you have to be very patient, but it can be very cool if you have the right space for it. So I want to just kind of finish up with my fun little collage of pictures from around my yard and pictures that I've found here and there. And just, I hope I have infected you a little bit with the bug of, there we go. I hope I've infected you just a little bit with the bug of growing native plants. Even if you start little. You can go from there, add a little bit at a time, and you'll be amazed at some of the things that you get to see outside. My husband was an engineering type and a pilot and all those kind of, Air Force guy, and he's the one pointing out the butterflies these days. He's totally hooked. So anyway, that's about all I have